Hey everyone, tonight I want to hit you with a number sequence that sounds like a glitch in the matrix, but it actually happened: 4%, then 90%, then 91%. That's not a crypto chart. That's one company's grip tightening around an industry until the industry stopped behaving like a market and started behaving like a machine. And here's the pivot, people miss: Rockefeller didn't win oil, he won the rules of oil. He didn't just sell kerosene, he engineered the way kerosene would be priced, shipped, stored, and allowed to exist. The name Standard Oil eventually died in 1911, but the method? The method learned how to survive, because if you're thinking, okay, the government broke it up, end of story, that's the fairy tale version. The breakup in 1911 didn't kill the organism, it forced it to evolve, like a predator that learns what traps look like, then starts hunting in the dark. And if you're listening in 2026, you're not outside that organism, you're buying gas inside it, you're paying for medicine inside it, you're scrolling inside it, you're banking inside it, you're eating inside it. That's the part that should feel a little cold. Standard Oil died as a name, but it lives as a method. So when I say the system, I'm not being poetic, I mean something specific. A playbook that creates durable power without depending on one brand, one CEO, or one era. Brands come and go, structures don't. A logo can get canceled, a structure can just relabel itself and keep walking. Think of the playbook like 5 blades on the same Swiss Army knife. One blade pulls the money inward by owning more steps of the supply chain. Another blade removes rivals so you don't even have to compete. Another blade bends rules so the fight never becomes fair again. Another blade hides control behind ownership layers so nobody can point at the hand on the steering wheel. And the last blade buys legitimacy so people stop seeing the knife. Vertical integration, horizontal consolidation, regulatory capture, trusts and holding companies, philanthropy as a shield. And here are the 3 promises for this story. Rockefeller built that knife, the breakup made him richer. And in 2026 you can spot the same blades in industries that have nothing to do with oil. You'll start noticing it the way you notice a pattern in wallpaper you've stared at your whole life but never really saw. Now, quick reality check, this is not academic, this is survival level literacy, because a system like this doesn't just concentrate power, it concentrates options. It quietly turns your choices into a menu where every item feeds the same kitchen. Wealth doesn't just rise to the top because some people work harder. A lot of it rises because the plumbing was built to pump upward, year after year, until it feels normal. And there's a practical, legal, grown-up takeaway right here, early. In the US, a company can be huge and still technically legal. Antitrust isn't big equals illegal. It's about conduct, market definition, and harm to competition. That nuance is why the method survives. The system doesn't need to break laws loudly, it just needs to win quietly inside the rules while everyone argues about the logo. So how does a human being become the architect of something like this? Rockefeller's origin story isn't a superhero movie, it's a spreadsheet with a pulse. As a young man, he was obsessed with order, clean books, predictable routines, controlled waste. He treated chaos like a moral failure. He treated efficiency like virtue. That sounds boring until you realize what happens when someone like that meets a market that behaves like a bar fight. And morally, he had a hinge belief that makes everything else make sense. Monopoly isn't agreed to him. Monopoly is stability. In his mind, if competition creates waste, then eliminating competition is basically public service. It is the kind of logic that can feel righteous right up until the moment you raise the person getting crushed by it. There's a line often attributed to him: competition is a sin. Whether he said it exactly like that or not, the worldview is real. Competition wasn't a sport, it was a disease, and the cure in his mind was control. Then oil shows up, and it's the perfect arena for that worldview. The industry in the late 1800s was wild. Prices whipped around, quality was inconsistent, refineries popped up and died like mayflies. You could make money fast, lose it faster, and spend the whole time guessing whether tomorrow's price would save you or bury you. It was a boom and bust machine with no seatbelts, and in that chaos, Rockefeller makes a decision that sounds simple but is basically the first cheat code. He doesn't chase the glamour side, he doesn't bet everything on drilling, which is high risk, high uncertainty, and full of people praying over holes in the ground. He aims for refining, the unsexy middle, the part that turns crude into products people actually use, because drilling is gambling, refining can be optimized. Here's the reversal. The power isn't in finding oil. The power is in deciding what happens after oil is found. Refining is the bottleneck, the choke point. If you control the choke point, you don't need to control the whole river. You can stand where the river narrows and charge everybody to pass. That is the shift from competing in a market to rebuilding the market around you. And once you see that, the next move becomes almost inevitable. He's not trying to be the best player on the field, he's trying to own the field. This is where the first phase really begins. He starts pulling pieces of the industry inside his walls, not as a flex, as a weapon. It looks like efficiency, it feels like progress, but it's also the staging area for a war nobody else realizes they're already in. And I want you to notice something that matters in 2026, because this is a modern habit too. When a company says, "We're just optimizing the customer experience," listen for the subtext. We're moving the leverage point closer to us. Sometimes that's great lower prices, faster service, fewer headaches. Sometimes it's also the moment your alternatives start disappearing without you noticing. Another practical, legal-minded takeaway. In the US, building a vertically integrated business is not automatically illegal. Owning multiple layers can be perfectly legitimate. The red flag is when integration becomes foreclosure, when it blocks rivals from key inputs, distribution, or fair access. The method isn't integrate, the method is integrate until everyone depends on you. So picture the mindset. You're Rockefeller, you stare at chaos and you feel disgust, not excitement. You believe order is moral, you find a bottleneck. Now you start tightening every bolt around it, one by one, until the whole machine runs through you. And once you can reliably be cheaper than everyone else, once you can survive prices that kill them, the next phase stops being business strategy and starts being math. Buy them or bleed them. By the early 1870s, Rockefeller wasn't dreaming about a bigger refinery. He was dreaming about a closed loop, not a company that competes inside the market, but a company that starts quietly owning the market's necessary organs. If you want to understand the method, stop staring at the product and stare at the path. Every barrel had to be contained, moved, stored, and sold. Whoever controls that path doesn't just earn profit, they decide who gets to exist. Here is the everyday definition of what he did next. He pulled the profit-making steps of the business into his own house, so outsiders had to pay him even when they weren't buying from him. That's vertical integration, but not as a corporate buzzword. More like building a private highway, then watching everyone else realize there's no other road. And yes, building a private highway can be legal in the US, the issue is what you do with the toll booth. If the toll booth becomes a weapon to block rivals, that's when regulators start asking questions. Start with the most boring object in the whole story, the barrel. In the 1870s, barrels weren't just containers, they were a cost center and a choke point. If you're buying barrels at market price, you're exposed. If your rival controls barrel supply, you're vulnerable. So Standard Oil pushed toward controlling containers and packaging, tightening waste, standardizing quality, and shaving pennies until pennies turned into a moat. People mock this stuff as bean counting, but in a price war, pennies are oxygen. If you can shave even 10% off costs while your competitor can't, you don't just make more money, you outlast them. And notice the moral trick here. It feels clean, it feels like good business, it feels like the kind of efficiency we reward. That's why it's dangerous. The same move that makes a product cheaper can also make a market less free. A practical takeaway for 2026. When you see a giant company optimizing logistics, don't only ask if shipping got faster. Ask who now controls the bottleneck that everybody else must use. That question alone will save you from a lot of naive takes. Next, transportation. This is where the method gets teeth. Oil is worthless if it can't move. In that era, railroads were the arteries, and Standard Oil treated rail access like a battlefield. They negotiated rates, rebates, and routing advantages, and the impact wasn't subtle. If one company gets a better rate per unit than everyone else, it's basically getting a hidden discount on survival. This is a legal education moment. In the US, price discrimination and exclusive dealing can be lawful or unlawful depending on the specifics, but the pattern to watch is whether deals are structured to injure competition, not just beat a competitor. Once you can ship cheaper, you can price cheaper. Once you can price cheaper, you can force others to bleed, and once others are bleeding, the market starts choosing you in a way that looks voluntary but isn't. The method doesn't need to threaten you with a gun, it just needs to make your cost structure impossible. That's the vibe, cold, quiet, and technically paperwork-based. The weapon is a spreadsheet, then storage. This part sounds like infrastructure porn, but it matters. If you can store more, you can smooth out chaos. When prices jump, you don't panic. When supply floods, you don't drown. You wait, you buy cheap, you sell steady. Storage turns volatility into leverage. In an industry where prices swing hard, the player with storage is the player with patience, and patience is a superpower when everyone else is desperate. Even a 20% capacity advantage isn't just more space, it's more time, and time is what kills your competitors. And finally, distribution. The last mile is where influence becomes dependency. When your distribution network reaches farther and more reliably, retailers start structuring their shelves around you. They build habits around you. They stop wanting to risk anyone else. Over time, even people who dislike you will say, yeah, but they're the only ones who can deliver consistently. That's not brand love. That's structural reliance. In 2026, this is why certain platforms feel unavoidable even when users complain every day. Reliability becomes a cage if alternatives are forced to be unreliable. So vertical integration creates two effects at the same time. The first effect is simple. You get a cost advantage. If your total cost per unit drops by $0.1, then by $0.25, then by $0.5, you can undercut everyone while still breathing. The second effect is darker. You get a power advantage. You become the gatekeeper of a chain your rivals must touch. When you control barrels, rail terms, storage, and distribution, you're not just competing on price, you're competing on access to life support. And here's the ethical twist you're supposed to feel. It looks like efficiency. It looks like modernity. It even feels like progress because prices for consumers can fall. But this isn't just being good at business. This is building a war machine that can win without ever admitting it's at war. If you want a clean, legal-minded lesson from this, in the US, a lot of the most consequential power moves are perfectly lawful in isolation. The danger is the combination when lawful pieces become an unlawful pattern that forecloses competition. Now the second phase becomes almost mechanical. When you're cheaper than everyone else for reasons they can't copy, the next steps aren't creative, they're procedural: offer, refuse, price war, by the ruins. This is where the Cleveland story lands like a set piece in a thriller. Picture the vibe in 1872, a cluster of refiners, each thinking they're in a normal market, each believing today's rival is tomorrow's partner. Then a representative arrives with what looks like a polite, even generous offer, a buyout, a merger, a join the family pitch. If you accept, you get paid. If you refuse, you're now flagged. Then the floor drops out, prices fall fast, not because the market naturally corrected, but because someone with deeper lungs decided to breathe underwater longer than you can. Prices go below your cost. You cut staff, you cut quality, you borrow, you pray for the month to turn. And Rockefeller can wait because his integrated chain keeps him afloat while you're burning cash. The cruelty of it is that it can be narrated as merit. They were more efficient, but the efficiency was built to make you bleed. Here's another legal education moment that matters now. Predatory pricing is notoriously hard to prove in U.S. antitrust because you have to show pricing below cost and a plausible path to recoup losses later. That legal difficulty is part of why the method adapts so well. If you want to be a smarter consumer of business news in 2026, don't just ask, are prices low? Ask, who can survive these prices and for how long? Sometimes low prices are a gift. Sometimes they're the sound of a door closing, and after the bleeding comes the final move, buying the ruins. A refinery that was worth $100,000 in good times gets snapped up for $30,000 in bad times, maybe less. Sometimes it's not even an acquisition. It's a shutdown. Either way, the outcome is the same. Fewer independent players, more share concentrated, more fear in the next city over. The story repeats like a montage of different streets, same script. After enough cycles, you don't even need to fight everyone, you only need to fight a few loudly until the rest decide surrender is rational. And when enough rivals vanish, your market share stops being a number and starts being a climate. People build businesses assuming you're the weather. The method graduates from competition to inevitability. That's why the phrase massacre sticks. It wasn't one dramatic battle, it was many quiet suffocations. Now, monopoly has two enemies that never sleep: law and public opinion. The moment the public starts using words like robber baron, the moment politicians smell blood, the method has to put on a suit. That's phase 3, structure. This is where the trust and the holding idea enters like a legal hack in 1882. The basic logic is chillingly elegant. Don't you look like one company running everything? Look like a web of ownership. You don't have to operate every piece directly, you just have to own the pieces that matter and coordinate them. It's corporate genetics, an early ancestor of the modern conglomerate where control is separated from the messy work of operations. You can say, we're not one company and still behave like one organism. And again, education note, corporate structures aren't illegal. Subsidiaries and holdings are normal. The problem is when the structure exists to evade regulation or to maintain coordinated power that competition law is trying to break. If you're a viewer who wants to think clearly about modern giants, the right question isn't do they have subsidiaries? The right question is, does the structure reduce transparency and accountability while preserving control? Because once you can hide control inside ownership, you can survive attacks that kill brands. You can change names, split units, spin off parts, and still keep your hand on the wheel. This is why the breakup story later hits so hard. People expect the hammer to smash the machine. The method expects the hammer and designs the machine to absorb impact. So by the time we reach the early 1900s, the system is no longer just an oil story. It's a story about how power learns. First, it learns to be cheaper. Then it learns to be feared. Then it learns to be invisible. And invisibility is the final upgrade, because the best cage is the one that looks like open space. And when the public starts noticing the cage doesn't disappear, it changes shape. That's why the trust matters. In 1882, Standard Oil didn't just grow bigger, it got smarter. A trust is the cleanest magic trick in capitalism. You take dozens of separate companies and you make them behave like one without having to look like one. The Standard Oil Trust Agreement was signed on January 2, 1882, pooling holdings under a small group of trustees, and the trust was valued around $70 million. In plain English, that's not just scale, that's central control with plausible deniability. And here's the educational punchline for anyone watching from the US today. Structures are not neutral. A corporate structure can be a tool for efficiency or a tool for evasion. Holding companies, subsidiaries, trusts, parent entities, none of that is automatically illegal. But if you want to understand why antitrust struggles, it's because the system can split itself in two legal boxes while keeping one brain. By 1890, the U.S. finally swings at the concept with the Sherman Antitrust Act, signed into law on July 2, 1890. That law is basically the government saying you don't get to replace the market with private rule. But enforcement is slow, politics are messy, and for years the method keeps running, and it's not like the public stayed quiet. The backlash wasn't subtle. Standard Oil got drawn as an octopus, tentacles around railroads, Congress, competitors. Then comes Ida Tarbell. She starts publishing her investigation in 1902, and by 1904 it becomes a book that makes the company feel radioactive. That's the moment you can almost taste hope, the idea that sunlight fixes it, that the story alone can break the spell. If you want a modern, legal-adjacent lesson here, journalism isn't regulation, but it changes the cost of being shameless. In a democracy, a company can survive lawsuits. What it fears is legitimacy collapsing. That's why PR exists. That's why philanthropy exists. That's why the method learns to look like a civic virtue. Then the government finally takes a real swing. In 1911, the Supreme Court decides Standard Oil Co. of New Jersey v. United States on May 15, 1911, ordering dissolution under the Sherman Act. People hear that and imagine a Hollywood ending, bad guy defeated, credits roll, except the method doesn't die. It does what living systems do under threat, it reproduces. Standard Oil is split into dozens of pieces, often described as 34 major companies. And here is the paradox that should make your stomach drop a little. Ownership didn't vanish just because the org chart changed. Stockholders received shares in the new companies. Rockefeller, the largest shareholder, didn't lose his claim on the machine, he just owned the machine in more pieces. That's why the breakup becomes a plot twist, not a conclusion. The parts could now rise separately in value, and the sum could become larger than the whole. Rockefeller's wealth increases after the breakup enough that people at the time talk about him becoming even richer, so the moral victory feels compromised, like the system got punished by becoming more efficient at surviving punishment. If you're a viewer who likes practical takeaways, here's one that matters when people argue about breaking up big companies today. Structural remedies can work, but only if they change incentives and control, not just names and paperwork. A breakup that leaves the same brains owning the same levers can turn into a reorg, not a cure. In U.S. policy terms, that's why modern antitrust debates aren't just about size, they're about durable power, foreclosure, and the ability to recoup control. Now zoom out. The saddest part is what happens next. Over decades, pieces recombine. Not always through literal mergers, sometimes through shared pipelines, shared finance, shared supply chains, shared lobbying, shared standards. The method doesn't require one logo, it requires coordination and leverage. You can cut the monster in half, but if both halves remember the same instincts, you didn't kill it, you bred it. And that brings us to tonight, 2026. If you think this is ancient history, I want you to try a quick mental exercise. Imagine you're escaping a giant company, not by breaking laws, not by going off-grid, just by choosing differently. You stop using one brand, you choose another, you leave one platform, you join a competitor, you switch carriers, you shop local, you feel clean for a week, then reality taps you on the shoulder, because the system isn't only the company you see, it's the method behind the company you can't see. Take modern vertical integration. When a business owns the marketplace and also competes inside the marketplace, that's the old refining bottleneck wearing a hoodie. You don't have to name names to understand the risk. The risk is that the platform can quietly tilt outcomes, fees, rankings, access, shipping speed, default placement until competitors are free to fail. In the US, that's why major regulators have been suing, not because integration is inherently illegal, but because the allegation is that certain strategies maintain monopoly power. And when you see a case like that, don't treat it like sports, treat it like civics. Now horizontal consolidation. The Cleveland Massacre was 1872. Today it's M&A, roll-ups, and synergies. You'll hear polite words. But the core move is the same. Fewer players, more coordination, higher switching costs. In 2023 alone, oil and gas M&A activity was reported around $250 billion, and deals like $60 billion and $53 billion weren't even shocking anymore. That's not nostalgia, that's gravity. Big players merge because scale is protection. Then the holding company trick. Banking has an entire legal ecosystem around this. The Bank Holding Company Act of 1956 exists because holding structures can outlive their original purpose and still keep their usefulness. That's corporate evolution in law form, and if you've ever wondered why financial power can feel both everywhere and nowhere, it's because layers protect control. When the public gets angry, the structure gives you a fog machine. Now regulatory capture, the blade people hate admitting out loud. In 2024, total U.S. lobbying spending hit about $4.4 billion. That's not a conspiracy. It's a business line item, and health and pharma don't just participate, they dominate. In 2024, pharmaceutical companies alone were reported around $293.7 million in lobbying. In 2025, healthcare-related organizations reportedly spent $334 million from January through September, and drug makers accounted for $161 million of that total. That's not evil, that's rational behavior inside a system where rules shape profit. Here's your U.S. law-friendly takeaway: lobbying is legal, petitioning, government is protected. The danger isn't that advocacy exists. The danger is when the only voices with time and money to be heard are the ones with the most to gain. If you care about policy, don't just argue the headline. Learn the process: agencies, rulemaking, comment periods, enforcement budgets. Power loves paperwork because paperwork is quiet. And now the softest blade with the sharpest edge: philanthropy. Philanthropy is where the method learns to be loved. Rockefeller becomes a symbol of that shift: industrial hard power turning into social soft power. Money flows into universities, medicine, public health, foundations. Some of it is genuinely beneficial, some of it is strategic, sometimes it's both at once, and that's the uncomfortable part. Because philanthropy can do three things at the same time: it can help people, it can lower taxes, and it can shape institutions that decide what good looks like. If you want a new way to think about this in 2026, don't ask, is charity good or bad? Ask, who sets priorities when private money funds public outcomes? That question doesn't cancel generosity, it just keeps your eyes open. Now we arrive at the part that feels personal because it is. You can't escape the system if the system is the infrastructure under your choices. You buy gas, but the chain behind the pump is consolidated. You get medicine, but the pricing, the rebates, the lobbying, the approvals, those are structural. You use tech, but the network effects, default settings, and market share do the herding for you. You bank, but the holding structure is designed to survive storms and regulation. You eat, but supply chains and distribution decide what cheap means in your neighborhood. So here are 3 escape attempts people try and why they usually bounce off the glass. First attempt, I'll switch brands. You switch from one seller to another, but both sellers rely on the same marketplace rules, the same logistics backbone, or the same payment rails. You didn't leave the system, you changed paint. Second attempt, I'll switch platforms. You leave one platform for a smaller one, but the smaller one lives on the same app stores, the same ad networks, the same cloud infrastructure, the same discovery algorithms. You didn't exit the ecosystem, you moved apartments in the same building. Third attempt, I'll avoid monopolies. You try to buy local, go direct, bypass the giants, but the local shop's inventory may still flow through concentrated distribution. The direct brand may still depend on the same ad gatekeepers to acquire customers. The rails are the rails, and the rails charge rent. That's why the system is invisible until you're dependent. It feels like convenience. It feels like normal life. Then one day you try to leave, and you realize leaving has a price tag: time, friction, higher costs, fewer options, social penalties, lost access. Here is the sentence I want tattooed on the inside of your brain: you don't escape by changing stores, you escape by changing infrastructure. And yes, that sounds depressing. So let's be honest about the trade-off, because pretending otherwise is childish. The system is effective, it can make things cheaper, it can make things faster. It can make things stable. Standardized logistics made products available, scale lowered certain prices, coordination reduced waste. That's real. Even critics admit kerosene prices fell dramatically over the late 1800s as refining got more efficient. But effectiveness has a price. The price is concentrated power. The price is wealth drifting upward. The price is that the same people who control the bottlenecks can shape the rules, shape the narrative, and sometimes shape what your society even measures as success. So what do you do with that as a normal person in 2026? Option 1. Accept it. Use the system. Take the convenience. Admit you're trading independence for efficiency. That's not cowardice. That's a conscious bargain. Option 2. Resist it. Not in a fantasy way, but in a lawful, practical way. Support competition where it actually matters. Interoperability, open standards, anti-lock-in rules, local resilience, policy literacy, vote in primaries, pay attention to state attorneys general, comment on rulemakings when agencies ask for public input. The system hates informed, boring people more than angry, loud people. Option 3. Position yourself. Learn the method so you can navigate it without being naive, understand network effects, understand switching costs, understand how markets consolidate. If you're building a business, don't build on rented land without a plan. If you're choosing a career, learn the levers: regulation, supply chains, incentives, because that's where real power sits. And now we can pay off the line because it lands differently after everything you've heard. Competition is a sin, not because it's morally true, but because for the people building systems, competition is the one force that can take their control away. So the method's entire job is to make competition feel unnecessary, then impossible, then unthinkable. If this made you uncomfortable, good, that means you're awake. And I want to hear where you personally notice the method in your life: gas, medicine, tech, banks, food, anything. Drop one example in the comments, because the fastest way to break invisibility is to compare notes. And if you want more episodes like this, cold, clear, and maybe a little annoying in the best way, hit subscribe. Not because I'm begging, because once you see the system, you start seeing it everywhere, and seeing changes everything. You can't escape the system, but you can see it.